For those who haven't met me, I'm Andraš Sekereš from Možda, Hungary. This lecture will be in English, and it's about the history of Korea. And just to give you an overview of the few thousand-year-old history of Korea. Of course, it's not an easy thing to do in 1 hour, but what we will do is just go over the major chapters of the history of Korea, how they are related, and basically what was going on there and how the Korean civilization developed. Who has some kind of interest in Korea from music or yeah, K-pop? K-pop is big. Okay. History, who is familiar with Korean history a bit? Okay. Wow. You don't need this lecture. Okay. So, we will not deal with the 20th century history, so I will tell the major chapters of the history of Korea up until the 19th century. The 20th century gets quite complicated and very much intertwined with the history of Japan and the Second World War and the Cold War and everything that. So, another tricky thing is that here we have a map of Korea, but the history of Korea is not the history of Korea. That's because the history of Korea covers a larger area than that is the current two Koreas. For most of its history, basically what was Korea was extended northward. So what is southern Manchuria and also from the Korean point of view to the northwest, which is currently China, Korean states and Korean history quite often expanded that way. So the history of Korea is about the history of a territory that is larger than the current Korea. And another thing is that you can talk about Chinese history basically on its own because China is quite big. And you can talk about Japanese history on its own because Japan is quite isolated. But Korea is neither too big, neither too isolated, so we will have to talk a lot about outside influences. So we will be talking about what's going on in China, what's going on in the northern steppe, what's going on in Japan from time to time. So you cannot understand the history of Korea in isolation. Okay. As for, well, you can see that here's a map of Korea. This is a peninsula, of course. We have Japan to the southeast, and we have China over in the west. And one interesting feature is that we have a lot of mountains. I can do this. Especially on the eastern side. So that means that the most fertile plains are here in the southwest. So that's one of the centers, southwest. Then you have the mountainous southeast region, and then you have the eastern territory, which expands usually upwards. So, and the climate is monsoon, but it's not so interesting for the history, just to know the place. So, every nation has its mythology about its origins, and usually every nation likes to exaggerate a little bit about their history, and usually bit means a lot. So, everybody does that. Yeah, everyone does that. Everyone does that. So, according to history, the kingdom of Joseon was founded 2333 before Common Era. Yes, I will explain why. Because it's because in Confucian tradition they like to historicize mythology. I mentioned that yesterday as well for the Chinese, that they had myths and gods, and they like to place them like historical rulers, and they created reigns of how long they lived. So then they could count backwards. It's a bit like when some scholars of the Bible try to add up all the numbers written in the Old Testament and calculate when Adam and Eve was born. So it's a bit of something like that. Well, that's why we have a date here. And actually this ancient kingdom is called Joseon, but there is also a Joseon in the later history of Korea. So once the later Joseon was founded, the old one was called Go Joseon. Go means old, so old Joseon. So we will refer to it for Go Joseon just to avoid confusion, but actually it was called Joseon, or it was not, because it's not sure it existed. But okay, but that's the myth. So the story goes on that there was Huanin, the Lord of Heaven. It's a very typical chief god for the Chinese and for a lot of the steppe people as well, the Lord of Heaven. And he had a son, Huanung, who decided to live on Earth because it seemed such a nice place. And he took 3,000 followers, basically gods, because so people who lived up in the heavens, we usually call those gods or spirits. So they came down to Earth and founded a city, which they call the City of Gods, Sinsi. And he set up a typically ideal ancient Chinese style kingdom with ministers for clouds, ministers for rains, everything. So this shows that they really were a pantheon of gods. And according to story, he was the culture hero who invented agriculture and this and that. So you have your typical culture hero, demigod, god kind of saint here. Now the story gets more interesting as because there was a bear and a tiger. And the bear and the tiger wanted to become human. So they prayed to Huanung, and Huanung told them, okay, you can become human. What you have to do is fast for 100 days, staying deep inside the cave, not being seen by the sun, and eat only garlic and mugwort. Mugwort is a medical herb. You see the bear is hugging garlic and mugwort. So this very sexy bear, that is a very important part of the story. So the tiger was a bad tiger, and he broke his fast. So he ate something else and he came out of the cave. But the bear did carry out this ordeal. He had this very healthy diet for 100 days. And he was turned into a man, into a human, more specifically into a woman. Yes? She is the bear woman. And the bear woman then, you know how women are, they always complain. So the bear woman complained to Huanung that she doesn't have a mate, she doesn't have a husband. Maybe all that garlic has something to do with that, I think, but anyway. And Huanung fulfilled this request as well, and he himself married the bear woman. So, and their son was called Dangun, and he is considered to be the first king of Korea, of the dynasty of Gojoseon. So he was the son of Huanung, the god who descended from heaven, and the bear woman. So he built his capital around what is currently Pyongyang, that's the capital of North Korea now, and called his kingdom Joseon, which is later named Older Joseon or Gojoseon. And the tricky thing with this myth is that usually the more ancient the myth seems, usually the later invention it is. So the first time this myth is mentioned in writing, it's actually from the 13th century Common Era. So it's like only 700 years when this story first appeared. So it's more like a mythology invented, but of course, an interesting thing, Kim Il-sung ordered his archaeologists to find the grave of Dangun. I'm pretty sure they did. I mean, if I were an archaeologist there, I would be rather motivated to find it if the leader said so. So, you know, you just have to find some tomb and say that this is the tomb of Dangun. It can be done. Creative archaeology exists. Okay, so that's the basic mythology of Gojoseon. And then the story goes on. 1,500 years passed. In some versions, they said that the descendants of Dangun ruled. Other versions say that Dangun himself ruled for 1,500 years. Why not? I mean, and then came Gija, Kizu in Chinese, who was a Chinese exile from the Shang dynasty. You may know that the first three dynasties of China are the Xia, the Shang, and the Zhou. And the Xia we do not have an archaeological evidence of, but the Shang we have. The oracle bone inscriptions from Anyang, they are from the Shang dynasty era. So this is a real historical dynasty in China. And it was, as usually told in Chinese histories, most of the dynasties fell because they became very decadent in the end. And the Shang is thought to be very decadent because they were drinking a lot of wine and they had orgies, and the last king even filled the whole lake with wine, and then they were boating there naked, and then they had huge parties there. So they were toppled because of that, and the new dynasty rose. And Kize was the brother or cousin, I think usually it's thought that he is a younger brother of this tyrant, who is called, by the way, Zhou, and it's quite confusing because he's the Zhou of the Shang dynasty, who is toppled by the Zhou dynasty. Anyway, so here is this Kize, and he is quite often mentioned in Chinese stories. So he may or may not have existed, probably he existed, and he's mentioned in Chinese stories. And after a time, they added the extra trivia to his biography that he went to Korea. But that was later. So he lived in the 11th century before Common Era, and the information that he actually went to Korea is like 1,000 years later. Can I have a plug for the notebook? Please. Okay. So, yeah, or maybe it's just unplugged. Let me check. It's better. I think there's some contact problem with the charger. So there was another. So the story is that. Okay, it's good now. Great. That Kize or Hija was the one who introduced all the fruits of Chinese civilization to Korea. And he was a quite popular figure during the Neo-Confucian period, that's the second millennium, so the last 1,000 years. But, well, you know, in the 19th century, there was the race nationalist era, and then the Koreans started to be not happy about having a mythical founder who is absolutely Chinese. So they started to dispute this and forget this part of their legends, because this was also a legend. So it's most likely it is also a legend. So we have these basically two stages of the Korean civilization in the mythological foundings: one by the god and the bear, and then later a Chinese exile. And what we think about it, if this means anything, then probably what we can piece out from this is that the Korean, probably these mythologies reflect how various peoples entered Korea and then formed a shared civilization there. So one of the interpretation is that there was an agricultural tribe who is represented by Hwanung and his gods, and there was probably a totemistic. Okay. There was probably a totemistic tribe with a totem of bear, that's why they were the bear woman. And maybe another hostile tribe who had the totem for a tiger, and they were the ones who didn't work out well with the agricultural people. And also real Chinese influence, which is reflected in the mythology of Gija. So that's what we can pierce out from the mythologies. Now, what can real history tell us? Historical mentions of Korea begin in the 7th century BC, and of course it means they are mentioned in Chinese sources because they were the ones who had writing back then. And so the Korean history started quite late, in the 7th century BCE, somewhere around there. There was a very heavy Chinese influence. It's from the Chinese state of Heian, because China was divided back in that time. This was the 7th century BC was the spring and autumn period, and from the 5th century BC we have the Warring States period. And Yan was the kingdom in the northeast of China that is basically, yeah, that was basically in this direction. So there was a very strong Chinese influence. If you were here yesterday, Yan was also the kingdom where this story about the sage who had immortality but died was mentioned. So that's the same state and same period. So in Korea there were, we know from archaeological records that there were walled city-states, and they were quite independent, and they slowly were united into kingdoms, which were, by Chinese style, they had adopted bureaucratic control and set up a proper state, so to speak. So that's how the early history of Korea went. While in the southern, and that's mostly the northern part of Korea. In the southern part, it was the development was even more late. So we know from archaeological records that hierarchical societies rose quite late, in the first millennium before Christ. So it's quite an interesting thing to see that how civilization spreads. So in North Korea, we already had walled city-states in the 7th, 8th century before Christ. In the South Korea, it took longer, and then bronze and iron arrived later. And then in Japan, it's even later. So the Japanese, again, they have a mythology that they were founded in 600 before Christ, but actually the Japanese were in Stone Age back then. So it's quite interesting that around the Common Era, when Christ lived or not lived, but whatever. So during the change of the Common Era, Japanese were still in Stone Age, and they were just receiving bronze and iron from Korea a bit later on. Because this also appeared quite late in the southern Korea. So southern Korea, for a certain time, was less developed, because all the civilizational developments came from China. So what we know is that there was a loose confederation of cities in the south. They were called the Mahan Confederacy. And they wanted to trade with China, but Gojozan in the north blocked them off. So they tried to make connection with China over the seas. So there was a naval trade in the eastern seas of China. So this is, for example, this is a golden shoe. This is actually a golden shoe from the South Korea from that period. So they had some weird fashion even then. Back then.
Something never changed.
Yeah, some things never changed. I wonder if they had the Gangnam Style dance back then as well. So, yeah, we never knew. So, the first documented ruler of Korea, and by documented I mean someone who is documented in contemporary documents. So it's not like that in the Middle Ages someone writes a chronicle about what happened 3,000 years earlier. But someone who is really mentioned in writing from the time where he lived. And he is Weiman, or as the Koreans call him, Viman, and he's again an exiled Chinese. So, if you think that the Koreans have an inferiority complex over the Chinese because many of their figures came from China, I think they take some kind of compensation from the fact that the Japanese imperial dynasty are actually a Korean dynasty. So the Japanese came from Korea as well. And the Koreans came from... Yeah, and if you tell that to any right-wing Japanese, he will, I don't know, he will probably be very angry at you. But so yes, he was a Chinese general from Yan, again, the same kingdom. And this was the period when China was unified. And China was not unified in an easy way, because what happened is that the Qin dynasty conquered all of China, and the first emperor became quite a big tyrant, you know, and you might have heard stories of him building the Great Wall of China and burning the books and all that very tyrannical stuff. So there was a great uprising against him, and then they toppled the Qin, but then the rebels started fighting against each other, and then finally Liu Pang, the founder of the Han dynasty, united, conquered all the other rebels, but he had a lot of allies. He was a very good diplomat. And he had a lot of allies, and he gave them parts of China, And later, he was also a bit like Stalin, for example, that he knew how to get rid of his enemies one by one. So first he had all these allies and he gave them various parts of China, and then one by one he accused them of treason and replaced them with his own family members. So in the end, before he died, all of the sub-kings in China, the various regions under him were held by the Liu clan, so only his relatives were there. And
Lancers are real, holy fuck. Lancers are real, holy fuck.
And so this is when one happened, and when this replacement was going on, that's when Weimon fled. Basically, he was a general of a king who was originally an ally of Liu Pang, but then later he became an enemy of Liu Pang. So Weimon fled to Korea. And what he did is he went to Gojoseon and applied for the king, and he convinced him to make him into a general. So he was made into a general and sent to the northwest. And then, like any good general would do, he simply took the throne, killed off the dynasty, and took over. So he is the first documented ruler of Korea. And he also made a kind of a deal with the Chinese, saying that basically he was a semi-vassal of the Chinese province in the Liaodong. Liaodong Peninsula is the peninsula that is a bit to the west of Korea. And then he went on conquering the southward a bit. So that's how we have the first Korean documented kingdom. But this happened because the Chinese state, after all those infighting, was quite weak. So the next phase of Korean history is the Chinese phase, because Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty, he was basically the great-great-grandson of Liu Pang, the one who murdered all his ex-friends and replaced them with his sons and, with his family members. So the problem the Chinese faced that after 3 or 4 generations, these family ties weakened. So because they were quite remotely related. So Emperor Wu was the one who killed all his relatives and replaced them with a more direct control of the territories of China. So he created a centralized strong Chinese state, and he was quite expansionist to deal something with about the nomad threat in the north. So the Chinese went on an expansive strategy, and they conquered Gojoseon as well. So basically they conquered North Korea and South Manchuria from the grandson of this woman. And they created 4 commanderies there, but only one lasted long enough, and that was the Lelang commandery. And for 400 years it stood. And just to give you some numbers, according to the census that the Chinese did, there were 400,000 Chinese colonists there. And it's pretty much. The whole population of Korea back then was around 2 million. So basically 1/5 of the Koreans were Chinese who were moving into this new commandery. So it's a bit like when the Roman Empire conquers a province and they settle a lot of legionaries there, or a lot of Roman citizens there. There was a lot of cultural interchange, and also the locals were also admitted to the bureaucratic elites. So there was a two-way interaction between the people. So that is basically how the prehistory of Korea, I would say, was set up. So we had some tribes, we had some early kingdoms, and then we had the Chinese setting up some prefectures on the northern part of Korea. So the real history of Korea begins now, which is called the Proto-Three Kingdoms era, which leads into the Three Kingdoms era. Yes, Korea also has a Three Kingdoms period, just like China. It's a bit different. So you can see here that here we have the Leilan Commandery, so that's basically part of China. And then the major players side, we have Goguryeo here in the north. We have the Mahang Confederacy that will later become the Paekje. And we have Silla here, which is quite small, that will be expanding. And this will become Kaya. So basically what we have is a lot of small states and confederacies. And a lot of fighting, of course, going on between them. So after some time, 3.5 players emerge. We have a large, huge state, Goguryeo in the north. We have Paekje, in the southwest, which is quite fertile. We have Koya, that's basically a river valley, and then we have Silla in the eastern mountains region. And one of the reasons why these could grow in power was that because the Han dynasty collapsed, and the Chinese power collapsed by the 3rd century AD. So first, the northern one was closest to China, most civilized, the one that had Chinese commanderies in its past, they conquered it. So they had a higher level of civilization, so they were the first to organize a strong state. And with the civilization that spread not only the state administration, but Confucianism and also Buddhism. Buddhism, which was introduced to China a few centuries earlier, and then it spread to Korea, and the Koreans spread it to Japan. So basically all these cultural things were traveling from west to the east. And iron technologies, literature, and so on. And basically, as time went on, more southern and more eastern regions became civilized. And being civilized also means centralized and better, more able to raise large armies. So of course civilization always was related to warfare as well. So, and one interesting thing of this period of Korea, when we have these 3.5 kingdoms, I'm saying 3.5 because you see the little one, Kaya, there, that was quite soon conquered by Silla, and then you really have only 3 kingdoms left. So an interesting thing is the relation with Japan, because one thing is that the Japanese are descendants of the Koreans. They might not like it, but that's quite evident. There is no question about it. The Japanese language is related and they're genetically related. And basically, the Japanese are Koreans who went to Japan and they displaced the Ainu, the natives. And also there were strong ties because the South Koreans were quite maritime. So they had a lot of sea trading and shipbuilding and things like that. And an interesting thing is that the Nihon Shoki, that is an ancient Japanese chronicle, the Nihon Shoki is from the 8th century. And the Nihon Shoki in the 8th century says that back in the 3rd century, there was a state in Korea, which is Kaya, basically, and that was controlled by the Japanese, or at least there were Japanese troops there. Now it's a bit strange because back then the Yamato state did not even reach Western Japan. So it's quite interesting so it's quite a weird thing if they had really had sent soldiers to Korea. What is more likely is that the Western Japanese were basically the same as the South Koreans. I mean that the families who ruled there, they simply moved over to Japan, but they still kept their blood ties. They were still alive together. So if one was attacked in Korea, the ones in Japan would probably send military help for them. So, in this early part, Japan was, in a sense, really part of the history of Korea because they were quite involved with all these wars that happened in Korea back then. And after the fall of Kaya, probably the aristocracy of Kaya fled to Japan, and that helped the foundation of the Japanese state. So, this is about the relation between Korea and Japan, and I said don't discuss it with right-wing Japanese. But, well, you know how it is. So, just a few images. The left one is a tomb from Kokoryo, the northern one, and the warrior in armor is a warrior from the Kaya Confederacy, so the one who has close ties with the Japanese. And what happens is that you have 3 kingdoms, and sooner or later one of them unites the whole area. And the winner is Silla in this case, although it took them some time and it was not an easy victory. Silla was in the east, the mountainous parts, so they were quite poor initially, but the introduction of ox-pulled plows and iron plows helped them greatly. You know, because if you live in a fertile valley, like in Egypt or Mesopotamia, then you don't need very dedicated technology to have good agriculture, because you live in a flooded plains. So every year there is fresh sediment the soil is easy to work. But if you live in a more mountainous, more dry, or less easily worked area, then the iron plow and the usage of ox to pull the plow is really helping agricultural productivity. The same thing happened in ancient Greece, by the way. So originally this area was a confederation of 6 clans, and they were basically rotating who the king is. So they had this kind of a strange round robin. One time you are the king, next time I'm the king. It's a bit like when children are playing.